Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest webinar. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. It will also be available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via nuca.com. Now about your WebEx Meetings webinar screen. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute themselves and unmute yourself. Questions will be asked at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you could submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read those written questions to our presenter at the conclusion of his presentation. Now let's get started. First, thank you for your time today, and thank you for participating in this year's summit. Today we are going to hear from NUCA's own lobbying staff about what to expect in a virtual meeting with your lawmakers. As a former staffer of the House Education and Workforce Committee, I can tell you that members and their staff crave expert interaction with their constituents on issues that affect their district. And the important work that you do every day literally affects the physical infrastructure of every voter and their families. Without our projects, lawmakers and voters won't have clean water, sanitary wastewater removal, or gas, broadband, or electric service. We are one of the most important industries in their district, and your expertise is needed by your two senators and one representative to make the right decisions. I'm joined today by our crack NUCA registered lobbyist, Zach Perconti. Every day he talks to the members of Congress, their staff, and the committee staff handling our issues in both chambers. Our government affairs team needs your help at Summit to get our industry's goals across to lawmakers. We need experts who can tell the story of your local infrastructure to lawmakers, and that's you. Thanks again for joining us today. Zach, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Bob. So why don't we just go ahead and get started talking about a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. If I can get the first slide, please. So today we're just going to cover a few things. This should be fairly quick. I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. But today I'm just going to explain a little about what Washington Summit is, what you can expect at a virtual fly-in, because things are a little different when you're sitting in front of your computer screen instead of actually in Washington. On that note, just a couple brief refreshers on video etiquette, especially important when we're in a formal meeting like this. I know most of us at this point have been doing this for at least a year, but it's always good to have a refresher. And then last, but certainly not least, a very important brief note about how to talk and interact with your members of Congress and their staff. So if we can get to that first bullet right there, what exactly is Washington Summit? Well, as NUCA members, we want to ensure that legislators understand the important role that our industry plays in keeping the country healthy, clean, and prosperous. It's easy for folks to get on the news and talk about infrastructure in theory. It's very easy for members of Congress to read the briefing papers that they're given by their staff and talk about what these problems that are facing our country look like on paper. But we're the folks that every day are actually out in the field doing the work of digging America, as we like to say, not the folks on the Hill. So at Washington Summit, we like to hold one day of meetings with your members of Congress and their staff to advance our industry's priorities and to share your stories with them to persuade them to act. This year, it's especially important that you participate in our summit and share your personal expertise with your lawmakers' offices. They want to hear about your experiences, what you know and what you do on a day-to-day basis. These personal stories are key to persuading lawmakers to make the right policy decisions. And that's especially valuable when it's not just coming from an industry expert, it's coming from one of their constituents, somebody who votes and participates in day-to-day life in their district or state. So a little more then about what to expect, right? This is just one day. But over the course of that day, it's a little bit of a marathon, not just a sprint. We're going to start with a virtual session. At that virtual session, we'll have a few recorded videos and possibly a live speaker from Congress talking a little bit about infrastructure issues. We'll also have a statement from the CEO. And then we'll also have a very brief recap of the issues that we're going to be talking about at Summit. Most of that material will be delivered to you in advance. We at Nuka National provide fact sheets, talking points, information about your members of Congress, and we'll also hold 1 week before Summit a webinar that talks a little bit more about the issues that we're trying to prioritize for the day of Summit. Our goal at Nuka National is for you to feel as prepared as possible going into these meetings, and that you have all of the tools you need to be an advocate for your district and your state. At these meetings that your EDs will set up with my help, you're going to sit down and talk either with your member of Congress or their staff. And that really depends on their schedule. Some members of Congress try to make more of an effort to meet with their constituents than others. But it might be the case, as it may very well be this summit, that your member of Congress just isn't available to meet. Usually, that's because there's either a vote going on the floor of the House or the Senate, or they're in a committee, or in some rare cases, they may be back home in their district. We generally try to schedule Summit for times when all of Congress, or as much as Congress as possible, will be in Washington, D.C. So you likely won't have to worry about that last one. But if your member of Congress isn't available to meet with you in person, that's fine. And the secret is oftentimes that's actually better. Talking to a staffer is just as good as talking to the legislator, if not even better. And the reason for that is, especially when we're working in an area that's not necessarily the committee of expertise for the lawmaker, or if the lawmaker is relatively new to Congress, staff policy experts will be the ones that are doing a lot of the actual work and crafting their office's policy, crafting legislation, and informing the members' stance on an issue. Much of the actual legislation that moves through Congress is written by these staffers. And a lot of these staffers, frankly, especially in the newer offices, will often have more experience than the lawmaker themselves working on these key issues. So if you're just talking to a staffer, that's totally fine. Now, it may feel a little weird. The secret in Washington is that much of the town is run by folks in their mid to late 20s, but that's totally okay. I mean, these folks, when they get to the Hill, generally specialize in a handful of issue areas, and they try to learn as much as they can to inform their members' position. Now, where you come in is as industry experts with a lot more experience usually, you're able to provide your valuable practical expertise, not just theoretical, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Another important thing to expect at these virtual fly-ins, your meetings are often going to be short, probably 15 to 20 minutes on average, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. It depends on if the member of Congress is able to join us, but that's totally okay. Generally, once the meetings start to drag on, either the conversation, sometimes it'll be valuable, sometimes it won't. But what's really key for you is you'll likely have a lot of these meetings lined up during the day. And frankly, so will a lot of the members of Congress and their staff. So keeping them short allows you to get your point across quickly without anybody losing attention or dozing off or zoning out. But it allows us to make the most of our day, either in Washington or, as this year, virtually. As I said earlier, we're going to provide you with everything you need for a successful meeting. So we'll give you talking points, fact sheets, background information on your key members of Congress, and we'll provide additional material that you can reference and direct them to that we at Nuka National have provided to Congress over the year. So that includes things like letters that Nuka has sent to Congress. It includes things like press releases and statements issued by our CEO, Doug Carlson, and our communications department. It includes testimony that Nuka has provided for the congressional record. What that does is, if the staff member is interested in learning more, you can direct them to Nuka's Summit website, and there that staffer will find a lot of additional background information that you can't necessarily get to in a 15 to 20-minute meeting. What I do want to emphasize, especially given what I've said about meeting with staffers and members of Congress and their background, is that remember going in that you are the industry experts, not the folks in Congress. That's you. You are the ones with many, many years of professional experience working in the utility industry. You're the ones that understand how America does build underground infrastructure and what's required to maintain, repair, and expand it. So be very confident when you talk, because you are talking from a position of knowledge. And it's in many cases, you're going to know a lot more than the staffer that's sitting on the other side of the computer screen. So bring that to the conversation. That is probably the most valuable thing that you can bring to the conversation. And it's a large part of why we do these annual fly-ins. So before we get into a little bit more about what these actual meetings look like, I just want to very briefly touch on video etiquette. Again, most of us at this point, Zoom meetings, we're kind of old hat at this. We've been doing them for over a year at this point. Most folks at this point, this is not going to be anything new, but it is worth repeating, especially when we're doing so many of these meetings in the middle of our own work days. I mean, the difference between these virtual meetings and the in-person meetings is we've got other stuff going on too. We're not actually in Washington. We're in our offices. We're at our homes, teleworking. And sometimes it is easy to get distracted by the other things that are going on during our busy work days. So just a couple of points when you're talking to staffers, and especially when you're talking to a member of Congress, just be mindful of where your camera is at all times. Turn your video off if you're not looking at the screen, or if you need to stand up and get something. Try to look into the camera when you're speaking. The most important one, mute yourself when you're not talking, or be mindful of your background noise. That is one that a lot of the times the folks in Congress, they won't always necessarily be able to do that. Sometimes, especially when you're meeting with multiple staffers, as offices increasingly begin to return to the Hill, they may be in their conference room clustered around a phone. There may be some background noise from their end. It's important that we minimize as much of that as we can coming from our side, just to keep the meetings running smoother. Avoid multitasking, but do take notes if you can. That is especially helpful for us at Nuka National, having your notes. We can't be in every meeting, but if you give us your notes, it's almost like we were there. And we will and do refer to those when we follow up with congressional offices throughout the year. Last but not least, it's helpful going into the meeting if you have your prepared materials ready to refer to in advance. That can mean a lot of different things. You can print them out, have them in front of you, highlight certain things that you know you're going to want to refer to. You could have them pulled off to the side on your screen. If you have them on a second monitor, again, just be mindful of where you're looking when you're talking. But other than that, as long as you have them ready to prepare to sometimes, you find that the meeting will flow much easier for you. You'll be more confident when you're speaking, and you'll easily be able to follow up with any questions that the members of Congress and their staff might have. So how to talk to your members of Congress is kind of the last thing that I want to get to. And this is what I usually get the most questions about from first timers. The number one thing that I can share with you that will make for a successful summit is don't try to play junior lobbyist. You don't need to go up there and start trying to refer to specific sections of specific legislation. You don't need to try to get into the weeds on technical issues. Don't try to do the advocacy work that lobbyists do every day. And the reason for that is, frankly, they hear from a million lobbyists every day. There is a whole industry in Washington that just goes to these congressional offices and does that for you. And for many, many, many other trade associations, companies, individuals, you name it. They don't want to hear from that when they're sitting across from a constituent. And it's not really valuable for you to be doing that either. It's going to be harder. It's going to be a little more stressful. The members of Congress aren't necessarily going to respond to it quite as well. It's not something you need to worry about. Instead of that, take advantage of the fact that you're a local constituent, and not only that, an industry expert. Don't just talk legislation, tell your story. So when you're sitting there and you're talking about water infrastructure issues, give your perspective on how these issues affect you and your business. If you pulled a 120-year-old piece of wooden pipe out of the ground on a job site last week, tell your members of Congress that. If you've pulled up a pipe that's got a lot of accumulation inside of it and it's a drinking water pipe, tell them that. Tell them this is what your constituents drink out of. If you're working on a gas distribution project and the pipe is old and corroding, let them know. I mean, if you are a constituent who's working on broadband projects, but your house doesn't have reliable service, tell them that. Let them know the way that things are in the ground in their district in a way that you probably know a lot better than them. And especially when we're talking about issues that affect your business, where you employ people in their district, which is just as valuable as being a constituent, let me tell you, tell them that too. Now, on that note, when you're talking with your members of Congress, you do want to try to make this conversational. So we will provide you with a script to follow as advice, but that script is not that's not the be all and end all of this conversation. You know, don't just read into it like you would if you were recording something. Use that as guidance. Use it to get the conversation back on track if it derails or if there's an awkward pause, but especially refer to that and the talking points as just ways to shape the conversation and cover generally what we think we should be covering. However, that's not, again, a strict rule. Talk about the issues that are important to NUCA, but your business as well. If there is a very, very, very pressing need in your district or for your company, say there is a large part of your district that has a problem with chronically failing water mains. There's an area that you've been called to do emergency repairs, and it's affecting other projects that you're working on. You can't find enough people to hire, and it's holding up a critical project, and you're not going to make the deadline that the state has put in front of you. Tell them that. Use those talking points as guidance on what to say and how to say it, but don't just read from them as bullets, because take advantage of the fact that frankly, you know more about your district than not only us, but oftentimes your members of Congress and their staff as well. So last but not least, again, going back to those talking points and the fact sheets and the material we'll give you, try to tie it back in at the end of the day to legislation. I know I said don't try to play junior lobbyist, but what I mean by that is don't talk about the specific bill for the entire conversation. But if you've just spent 15 minutes talking about how there is a dire need for broadband service, or your cities and states' pipes are at the point of failure and desperately need to be replaced, or you know the magnitude of projects that are there to be done, but the state just doesn't have the money for them, that's when you tie in the legislation. So that's when you say the House bill for water state revolving fund reauthorization is something that we really need to get done, because we know that if that bill passes and it gives $50 billion to water infrastructure projects, that we can make a big difference. We can hire more people. We can make sure that our cities and states and towns have reliable access to clean water. You can talk about the broadband bill. You can say, if this bill passes, we'll be able to bring service to X number of towns around us. We'll be able to stay competitive. Our rural towns will be able to keep up with the rest of the state because they'll have the level of internet access that is necessary to do events like Washington Summit. Above all, relate it to your personal experience. If there's only one thing you take away from this webinar, tie it back to your personal experience. Again, you are the experts. Let them know that. So that's kind of my quick introduction to Washington Summit, what it's like, what to expect, and how you can talk to your members of Congress. Does anyone have any questions?
And to ask a question, just unmute yourself, or if you're shy, you can certainly type it in the chat and send it. I'll be happy to read it. Zach, I have one question, of course. There's been so much talk about infrastructure over the past month. People have seen it, the Biden administration proposal. Will that be part of this summit?
Excellent question. So we could not be holding Washington Summit at a better time if we tried. In fact, for the first time in as many years as I think anybody can remember, the conversation around infrastructure in Washington is serious in a very real way. And it's not just a partisan issue. Folks on both sides of the aisle want to get a deal done to repair and expand our nation's infrastructure, and in many cases, our nation's underground infrastructure. The Senate has already taken action towards that, passing Senate Bill 914, the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021, which provides $35 billion towards the drinking water and clean water SRFs over the next 5 years. That bill still has a long way to go, but it's an example of how Congress is already starting to piece together legislation that collectively would make up some sort of either compromise or direct implementation of the president's infrastructure package. We are doing Washington Summit at a perfect time to make a real difference in this legislation. It's likely that the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will be holding hearings and potentially even votes on major water infrastructure language and potentially even surface transportation language right around the time of Washington Summit. What's more, we're hearing that major bills will likely start moving to the floor of both chambers in June. So participation in Summit this year is more important than ever. We're going to be coming in at a pivotal time in this conversation to make a real difference in the language that reaches the floor and hopefully the president's desk. And bringing your perspective as industry experts to that conversation is more valuable than I could possibly put into words.
Zach, we have a message on, or a question from chat. Some of our participants today aren't just members, or also our executive directors, who are also some of the first time actually going through the virtual process, or even I'd say at that point also just the congressional fly-in experience. One question was, how are we going to end up, how are executive directors doing the setup meetings for the event? We know our members themselves aren't making them. Any advice to end up giving to our executive directors in terms of setting up the meetings themselves?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we try to do is to help make that process as smooth as possible for the executive directors. So y'all can focus on, one, getting your schedule together for the day, but two, preparing for Summit. So what we've done for you is we've already sent out a couple of templates that can be used to contact congressional offices. There's one for the House, one for the Senate. That letter is just a simple meeting request. It also goes into a little detail of the topics that we're going to discuss at Summit. What will be coming to you, you mean the executive directors, very soon, you're going to get two documents. The first is a list of all of the key members of Congress that we want to prioritize for Summit. That being folks in congressional leadership, as well as people who sit on key committees of interest to NUCA. That will be provided very soon, along with a second document, which is a spreadsheet that contains contact information for every one of those congressional offices. So all you will need to do as an executive director to set up meetings with those offices is take the template letter, address it, email it to the email addresses that are contained in the spreadsheet, and just wait for a response. Now, if there are additional offices that you would like to contact, say neither of your state senators sit on a committee of importance to NUCA, or there's a major project in a city within your chapter's area that the representative isn't on any of our key committees, but they still need to know about it. In that case, what you do is you just shoot me an email, and I will get you their contact information very quickly. If there's anything that I can do to support making meetings, you can also reach out to me and let me know. But for the most part, we're going to try to provide you with all of the materials you need to make setting these up very easily. And then once you've scheduled them, NUCA National has a spreadsheet where you can enter in the information, the time, the member, and the meeting link, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, whatever you've either provided the congressional office or in some instance, they will provide you. And the reason that we ask you to do that is throughout the day of Summit, myself, my colleague Eben Wyman, Doug Carlson, our CEO, as well as other folks from NUCA National, including Director of Communications Robert Baylor, will be joining meetings throughout the day to support or just provide additional information if requested. We are here to help and make the process go as smoothly as possible. So if you do have any follow-up questions after this webinar, just shoot me a note and I will get back to you on them as soon as I can.
Thank you, Zach. One other, I guess, comment. I don't see any other questions popping up. There was one thing I observed. Robert Baer, Director of Communications, and I had chanced probably in about maybe half a dozen of the meetings. Some were taking place in the office, your office. Some were taking place in formal boardrooms. Pretty much you can hold these meetings wherever you want to, where you are, wherever you're comfortable, and obviously whatever presentation you'd like with to present to your company to an audience like a lawmaker. I would love to see it if one of them would end up doing it from a job site that's actually out there. That would really make an impression with that congressional office. So if anyone wants to do it that way, that'd be great. Just be sure about your background. All the job sites I've been on, of course, incredibly noisy. So we wouldn't want that noise to end up drowning out the fine messages that you would end up presenting. And I think that's about it. We're almost at the half-hour mark as well, too. And if there are no further questions, I think we'll go and wrap this up. Zach, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our guests. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on the WeDigAmerica.org website and on our YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for the opening Washington Summit webinar and supporting NUCA. Our next Summit webinar will be held next Wednesday, May 12th, and is titled Preparing for Summit. We call this one Reviewing U.S. Civics 101, and is going to feature Evan and Zach discussing the basics of legislation and effective lobbying, and answer your many questions to better prepare yourself for Summit and NUCA's ongoing advocacy program. Developing an effective relationship with your federal lawmakers can be one of the most rewarding partnerships you can ever create for your business. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.